of you? I want it to be so quiet in here that we can hear the sound of the clock ticking. Is that understood?
Yes, Master.
Very good. Now then, we shall begin today with some mental arithmetic. Now, if you consider the distance between... Yes, boy, what do you want?
He was speaking Welsh.
Come forward to the front of the class. Take off your cap and give me the Welsh knot. You may now sit down. You boy, stand up. You know the rules in this classroom. If you're caught speaking Welsh, you have to wear the Welsh knot. And the child wearing the Welsh knot at the end of the day is punished by 6 strokes of the cane. Take your hat off, boy. Your cap back on. Come out to the front. Put your hand out, boy. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let that be an example to you all.
And it was. From now on, the Welsh language was literally hammered to its knees. Everything Welsh was branded unworthy. Its history, its customs, and of course its language. What saved it was the nonconformist revival. Oh, and that little concession from Elizabeth, the Welsh Bible. Welsh chapels with their inspirational hymns became more numerous than Norman castles and Anglican churches. And they meant more. The academic world that had done so much to obliterate Welshness was ironically one of the very sources that fostered Celticism. As far back as the 17th century, John Aubrey, antiquarian par excellence, linked the Celtic Druids with ancient Stonehenge. It's a link that has persisted down to our own age, despite its lack of credentials. In the middle of the 18th century, William Stukeley added his authority to the argument. He studied Stonehenge and came to the same conclusion. This was an ancient temple linked to the Druids. The Druids captured the imagination. But then, in 1707, the very year of the union with Scotland, the Welshman Edward Llwyd published a truly scholarly work on the Celtic family of languages.
The notion of Celticness actually was an alternative group identity for all the non-English peoples of the islands. And I believe this is one of the reasons it became such a tremendously successful idea during the 1700s. It spread like wildfire from a new invention really around about 1700 to something that everybody took for granted by the early 1800s.
But the one who really brought things to focus was a stonemason, a forger, and a genius, Iolo Morgannwg. He literally invented the Gorsedd of the bards of Britain.
He married it with the Eisteddfod in Carmarthen in 1819. And this institution, this creation of Iolo's remarkably fertile imagination took root in Carmarthen. There were people there who were not so keen on welcoming it, because it gave, as it were, a view of Celticism which the progressives were, they looked askance at it, because it gave the impression the Welsh Celts, they were somewhat cranky, not quite moving with the times, not too fond of facts, and, rather prone to lose themselves in fantasy. When they brought the Gorsedd, as it were, face to face with the Welsh people in all its colourful glory, a number of people were immediately taken up by it. And from 1858 onwards, way down into our own days, the Gorsedd has been there, central to Eisteddfod activity. Iolo had found something which was true. In other words, the bardic tradition in Wales has been central, if you like, to the Welsh way of life. And Iolo created this institution, planted it in the Eisteddfod, at a time when there was a great danger of the Eisteddfod being engulfed by this tide of Britishness, Prydeiндod, as we call it in Welsh. The Gorsedd of Bards plays an important part in signifying that we intend to continue to be.
In Ireland, the intention to continue to be was a thorny problem. At the start of the 17th century, Ulster was the most Irish, Gaelic and Catholic province in Ireland. The plantations and perpetual Protestant rule from London had now changed all that.
The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Let us pray for the hungry peoples of our world, and that those with plenty may find ways to share.
To share, in the context of 19th century Protestant triumphalism, was an impossible concept to grasp. Catholics could not hold office or even purchase land within their own country. In the 19th century, a Catholic in Ireland would have to profess, and I quote from the Test Acts, "I believe that in the sacrament of the Lord's Supper there is not any transubstantiation of the element of bread and wine into the body of Christ." And that the adoration of the Virgin Mary or any other saint are superstitions and idolatry. How could a Catholic population ever accept such terms? It didn't, and what follows beggars description. The Great Potato Famine of 1846 immediately found 1 million people dying from starvation. The union with Ireland in 1800 had been passed on a promise of full Catholic emancipation. It was a promise that was not honoured. And what did politics offer a people dying of hunger? The eventual repeal of the Test Acts still meant that the Irish owned no land. They were peasants, owning nothing but empty stomachs. Evicted from the hovels they called homes, they joined the other dispossessed of Europe and sought a new world.
Of having their photo taken. They were executed by firing squad. Queen Victoria's haemophilia gene had played a terrible part in bringing to an end the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty.
It might not be too much to say that the final assassination came about because of the haemophilia. The fact that the Tsarevich had it, that Rasputin gained this undue influence over the Empress and over the Emperor, and that the royal family then lost a great deal of their popularity. And I think the revolution would have come anyway with or without the haemophilia. But nevertheless, it was a contributing factor. And in the end, the imperial family simply had to pay the price.
It wasn't just in Russia that the monarchy was under threat of revolution. In Spain, one of the grandest royal families, the Bourbons, were only hanging on to power by a thread. And here too, the tainted blood of Queen Victoria would spread disaster. Aged just 19, King Alfonso XIII fell for the blonde good looks of Ina, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, ignoring the warnings that she too might be a carrier of haemophilia.
Alfonso XIII knew all about the haemophilia. By then it was pretty well known throughout the courts of Europe. But he was a very daring, very dashing young man, simply prepared to take the chance. And she looked to him so beautiful, he couldn't believe that she could be a carrier, which is nonsense, of course. You don't have to look like anything to be a carrier. But he was ready to take the chance, and he thought it's a risk worth taking.
When their first son, nicknamed Alfonsito, was born, it appeared the royal line was secured. But at his circumcision, the terrible bleeding confirmed the worst. The heir to the throne had haemophilia. The Spanish people believed the boy's poor health was a punishment for centuries of greed and overindulgence in the monarchy. The king could not forgive his wife.
I cannot resign myself to the fact that my heir contracted an infirmity which was carried by my wife's family and not mine. I know I'm unjust, but I cannot think of it any other way.
In Spain especially, where there were so many political assassinations, it was very important that the heir was strong and healthy. I mean, there was a rumor spread by the peasants, believed by the peasants, that a young Spanish soldier had to be killed every day so his fresh blood could be pumped into the heir to keep the heir alive. Now, a lot of people believed this.
As Alfonsito came of age, he only made brief public appearances, confirming the rumors that he was unfit to rule. It was a godsend for the growing Republican movement.
Well, the fact that there was haemophilia in the family weakened their position a great deal. As the Republican movement grew in Spain, so did the Republicans realize that they really had a stick to beat the royal family with, because there was a strong chance that the dynasty couldn't go on.
Hemophilia was the final straw for the Spanish royal family. In a ballot in 1931, the monarchy were evicted from the throne, and Spain became a republic. The desire to marry into Queen Victoria's bloodline helped destroy two of the greatest royal families in Europe. But hemophilia was not the only disease lurking in Queen Victoria's family blood. Queen Victoria was the original source of the tainted hemophilia blood in the royal families of Europe. But amongst her ancestors, there were traces of another inherited disease. It is said that Prince Albert always lived in fear of bringing out what he called the hereditary malady in Queen Victoria. He was referring to the so-called madness of Victoria's grandfather, George III. King George went down in history as the Mad King. But in fact, his medical records revealed that his strange behavior was caused by a mysterious illness passed down through the royal bloodline. It was at a time when no monarchy could appear weak. Just across the Channel, a bloody revolution was breaking out in France. A letter written at the time records the start of George's problems.
This letter's dated the 20th of October, 1788. Very important. It's right at the beginning of George III's illness. It's written to his Prime Minister, William Pitt. You can see at the beginning of the letter he starts writing in a very legible, very neat cursive script. I've not been able to answer Mr. Pitt's letter sooner, but the writing is becoming more and more illegible. He says at the end, "I'm afraid Mr. Pitt will perceive I'm not quite in a situation to write at present." He's apologising to Pitt at the end. In fact, it's very revealing of his mental state. I think it underlines the fact that George isn't, in a modern sense, mad here. He's not suffering from any insanity. Neither is he suffering from senile dementia.
That's it. Now rest.
The letter reveals that George was aware that he was not his usual self. For days, he'd suffered from cramps, shooting pains in the legs, and blisters on his skin. He barely slept and was extremely agitated. At the time, George was attended by the royal physician, Sir George Baker, whose notes on the case are still preserved. His doctor was in a terrible position. He didn't know what was causing the king's bilious attacks, and yet it was his responsibility to make him better.
Baker initially puts the king's symptoms down to eating 4 pears and treading on wet grass. He's not got a clue what's going on. As the disease unfolds, they really can't attribute it to anything apart from a very obvious diagnosis of insanity.
But the doctors failed to observe King George closely enough and ignored symptoms that might have helped them make a diagnosis.
An obvious physical symptom that modern doctors would have seized on is the fact that his urine changes colour to this, well, it's likened to blackcurrant jelly later on. It becomes a very sort of dark, purpley colour. That the urine, which is such a telltale signifier of what's really going wrong with his insides, is completely ignored and it's thrown away.
Each day with him, the pain is in a different...
The doctor's diagnosis was of vital importance. When they started to suggest that the king had gone mad, it threw into doubt his ability to reign. But what they couldn't possibly know was that there is a rare genetic disease which causes temporary delirium and terrible pain, called Porphyria. Professor Tim Cox at Addenbrooke's Hospital still sees patients today with Porphyria. It's a disease that affects the whole body. Sufferers are missing a vital element in the blood. Without it, chemicals build up and poison the blood. These chemicals can even cause porphyria patients skin damage when they're exposed to light.
George III had the pains that we associate with this condition, acute and severe attacks of pain in the limbs, in the muscles, in the back, and also in the abdomen. There may be mental disturbances, agitation, a rapid pulse. There are reports that he had skin sensitivity to light, so exposed skin would show blisters and be painful on exposure to bright sunlight in particular.
Unfortunately for the king, his doctors were scrabbling around for a treatment, and in doing so, only made things worse.
Now, do you good. Do you very, very good.
Baker prescribed a dose of James's powder, a remedy popular in the 18th century for treating fevers.
That will do you very well.
But it contained a poisonous metal called antimony.
That's excellent.
I would not be at all surprised if it induced porphyric attacks. A whole range of drugs are dangerous, and even little differences in structure may induce an attack. Literally hundreds, maybe thousands of drugs in common medical usage today will trigger attacks of porphyria.
The medical profession as a whole still believed in this medieval idea of the humours of the body that were carried by bodily fluids. And any illness, really, any bodily illness, was treated by trying to attract the humours out or letting them out. The last thing his body needs, of course, is additional pressure on the stomach. But what Baker does is give him a whopping great dose of laxatives, which just goes straight through him and means that he's even iller than when he started.
For weeks, George was subjected to bizarre treatments. Painful blistering agents were applied to his skin. Cups were used to try and draw out the ill humours.
Very good, Your Majesty.
They were certainly no help, and probably only made him even more dazed and confused. Yet despite the terrible treatment George received, he had periods when his attacks of pain would subside, and he would appear quite normal.
Patients with porphyria that I know are not mad. They're only mad because they're in pain or deluded during the acute attacks that they suffer. And in between times, they are perfectly normal people, and therefore their sanity never comes into question.
By February 1789, George was sufficiently recovered to return to his duties at Windsor. The country had managed to survive what they thought was a temporary episode of insanity. But had it been known that this could be passed on to George's heirs, the consequences for the royal family might have been very different.
If George III's subjects had known or been made aware that it was indeed porphyria, from which he was suffering, a hereditary disease which carried in itself the seeds of its own destruction, then I think they would have been tolerated a lot less, and we could have seen the end of the Hanoverian dynasty. The present Queen would not be with us. And the installation, perhaps, of either another suitable Protestant dynasty, reigning constitutionally, or perhaps Britain would have been a republic.
If George did have porphyria, then where did it originate? And how far back in the royal family can it be traced? To find out is a real detective case, because the porphyria gene can lie hidden for generations and then trigger an attack out of the blue.
Porphyria is transmitted from generation to generation as a tendency, and it's perfectly possible for a generation to be, as it were, missed. They've inherited the trait, but they don't show the attacks.
Scientists now believe they found striking evidence of porphyria 200 years earlier in George's great-great-great-great-grandfather, James VI of Scotland, James I of England. James was one of the most unusual kings ever to sit on the throne, by turns described as a genius and a buffoon. Could porphyria explain his bizarre personality? The answer could lie here, in the British Library, where an extraordinary clue was found: the medical report of James I. The notes were made by a pioneering physician. Turquet de Mayerne. He was the first to systematically record his observations, and so provides a remarkable daily account of James's sufferings.
On the 12th of July, 1613, he says that the king woke up in great pain, and he then vomited, and he was in pain for most of the day. He had difficulty passing urine. His pulse was very fleeting, and his urine was very bloody, turbid, like Alicante wine.
This is a glass of wine from the Alicante region of Spain. It's very dark. This wine colour may be seen in the urine of patients with acute porphyria. The urine may be just darkened, tea-coloured. It may be slightly pink, particularly on standing, or it may take on this sort of colour, as with a patient of mine who recently was beginning an attack of porphyria and noticed that her urine had changed colour in this way.
On its own, dark-coloured urine is not enough to diagnose porphyria. But Mayerne recorded many other symptoms that were remarkably similar to those suffered by George III.
Mayerne notes that James suffered very, very often from stomach pains. He also suffers from constant diarrhea, and that he's got a very delicate skin, which can hardly stand anything on it. And he says this more than once. Many of his physical diseases are brought on by his mental state.
James went down in history as something of a paradox. He was known to be extremely learned, yet was also described as a fool. He could fly into a rage, and the next minute be cowering in a corner. When James died unexpectedly on the 12th of May 1618, it was widely believed that he'd been poisoned. But in fact, porphyria is itself a form of blood poisoning that can cause sudden death. The extraordinary details left by Mayerne reveal that another king, like George III, who was labelled as mad and unstable, may have in fact been suffering from porphyria.
I think we can say that porphyria was transmitted down genetically from James I, and indeed that James I himself suffered from attacks of acute porphyria in his lifetime.
But if James had porphyria, who did he get it from? Can it be traced any further back in history? His doctor's report holds a clue. It states that King James compared his colicky pains to those that were suffered by his mother. It suggests his condition was inherited. James's mother was Mary, Queen of Scots, who reigned over Scotland from Holyrood Palace. This was the backdrop to a short but turbulent reign, involving 3 marriages and 1 murdered husband. She went down in history as a wild and passionate woman, prone to hysterics.
One of the things that Mary Queen of Scots was known for was that her health, although often robust, was punctuated by episodic illnesses. And really, after the age of about 16, every couple of years, she went down with something. And the symptoms were always the same: vomiting, abdominal pains, tears, depression. She would take to her bed. On one occasion, it was said that her whole appearance changed.
Unfortunately, Mary's instability was often dismissed by her male physicians.
Mary Queen of Scots was described by her doctors at times as being hysterical, and I think again this may represent the distress she encountered during the times of acute illness, and when she had flitting pains in her limbs and in her abdomen, and when they examined her they could find nothing to account for it in terms of conventional medicine.
Like George and James, Mary's illness was never truly explained in her lifetime. But if the diagnosis of porphyria is correct, then it is possible that it could be traced as far back as 1566. But if so, where is it now? Did the disease disappear? Or could it still be lurking in the bloodline of the British royal family? Was Porphyria? Then could it still be found in the royal bloodline? The latest DNA technology offers a chance to finally solve this mystery. A sample of DNA from a sufferer could provide evidence that the Porphyria mutation was in the royal bloodline. But to get a DNA sample means exhuming actual royal bones. The hunt was on across Europe for a descendant of George III who suffered the telltale symptoms of Porphyria. Historian Professor John Roll found a remarkable clue in letters written by an obscure German princess, Charlotte of Saxe-Meiningen. She was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria and a great-great-granddaughter of George III. Charlotte had a series of mystery illnesses, the symptoms of which were never fully explained. But a closer look at her letters seemed to show that Porphyria had struck again.
She was complaining about headaches, about lameness, terrible stomach pain, blisters on the skin all the time, this kind of thing. But I couldn't place what was wrong with her until I turned the page. I remember the date of the letter was the 7th of April, 1906. And there on page 2, 3 magical words in line 4, urine, dark red. And suddenly I'd realized that the porphyria that George III had suffered from had actually got through Queen Victoria to Queen Victoria's eldest daughter Vicky and through to her eldest daughter Charlotte of Prussia.
Charlotte raised a new possibility for biochemist Professor Martin Warren, who was also on the hunt for the Porphyria gene. He realized that if they could get hold of a bone sample of Charlotte, then he could look for the Porphyria mutation in her DNA. In 1997, John Roll obtained permission to exhume Charlotte's body. And with Martin Warren, he went to the gravesite to extract a crucial DNA sample from her body.
The grave itself was in very good condition. And once they took the large stone slab off and we saw the lead-lined coffin remains, I mean, on top of that, in fact, were the remains of a flag which had obviously been used to drape the coffin at her funeral.
We saw her skeleton, we saw her hair, we saw what looked like the remains of flowers that she might have held in her fingers. Martin Warren then put his hand into this hole and pulled out a femur.
I was then able to remove a few bone samples from the remains of the coffin, and this was one of those defining moments which may allow us to determine whether Porphyria had racked the royal families of Europe or not.
For the first time, they had a royal sample of DNA from a potential sufferer. This was a chance to finally prove whether Porphyria was in the royal bloodline. But Charlotte died in 1919. Such old DNA is extremely fragile. They had to extract a perfect sample to decipher her exact genetic code, letter by letter.
The trouble is that when you're looking for a mutation within a gene, it's very much like looking for a needle in a haystack. It is one typographical error in a chapter of a book, and there are maybe 5,000 or 6,000 characters within that chapter, and it's a case of trying to find one change, one letter change within that book chapter. So it's extremely difficult and extremely tedious.
But after months of analyzing the data from the bone sample, they found a single letter change in part of Charlotte's DNA sequence. This one change was genetic proof that Charlotte carried a mutation in the Porphyria gene. To double-check that it was a new mutation, they sampled the DNA of over 100 people. No one else had this mutation.
We found the actual mutation in her DNA. To me, there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever possible that this is what she was suffering from, indicating that it must have come to her through her mother, Queen Victoria's eldest child, Vicky, that Queen Victoria herself must at least have been a carrier of the disease. To me, the case was absolutely clear-cut.
It now appeared that Queen Victoria had carried the mutation for two critical royal disorders, Hemophilia and Porphyria. Since our present royal family are directly descended from Queen Victoria, there is a likelihood that by genetic chance, Porphyria might strike one of our present Queen's generation. In fact, it has been discovered, only one step removed from the throne, in the Queen's cousin, Prince William of Gloucester.
Prince William of Gloucester was in many ways a rebel prince. He was a kind of daredevil, royal court in a gilded cage, and he tried very much to break away from the constraints of royal life.
Despite this tough image, Prince William was plagued by illness and was sent to see Dr. Hedley Bellringer. Whilst investigating the case of Porphyria in the royal family, Martin Warren received a revealing letter from Dr. Bellringer, who had diagnosed Porphyria in Prince William.
This is what Dr. Bellringer wrote to me. He said, feces and urine were sent to Addenbrookes Hospital in Cambridge, where it was reported that porphyrins in the feces were considerably in excess of normal, and that is a very characteristic symptom of somebody suffering with porphyria.
Taken with reports from other doctors, this was proof that porphyria was found in Prince William. It suggests that he inherited the gene from his grandfather, George V, who was also the grandfather of Queen Elizabeth II. The problem for hereditary monarchy is that once there is a genetic disease in the family, it is very hard to get rid of it. The drive to maintain a pure, unbroken royal bloodline has ensured that more than just wealth and status were inherited. Genetic defects were passed on too. And when blue blood was all that mattered, many royal families paid the ultimate price for this deadly obsession. On the next Royal Deaths and Diseases, extraordinary tales of tragedy, joy and humiliation in the struggle to produce a royal heir.
On which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an annus horribilis.
The press had recognized that Diana and Charles's marriage was really over when the princess, leaving her husband behind, had staged a melancholy sit-in at India's Temple of Love, the Taj Mahal. In Parliament, the Prime Minister, John Major, prepared the House for solemn news.
I wish to inform the House that Buckingham Palace are at this moment issuing the following statement. It reads as follows. It is announced from Buckingham Palace that, with regret, the Prince and Princess of Wales have decided to separate. Their Royal Highnesses have no plans to divorce, and their constitutional positions are unaffected. This decision has been reached amicably, and they will both continue to participate fully in the upbringing of their children.
Just 4 days later, Princess Anne would marry for a second time. Prince Charles and Andrew would not be accompanied by their estranged wives. Anne was marrying a palace equerry called Timothy Lawrence in a ceremony that was essentially private and for family only. The estranged wives, Diana and Fergie, continued to attract press attention wherever they went. It became so overpowering for Diana that she tried to withdraw from public life.
I was not aware of how overwhelming that attention would become, nor the extent to which it would affect both my public duties and my personal life in a manner that's been hard to bear. And always your love and care has eased that journey. And for that, I thank you from the bottom of my heart.
On the Queen's insistence, Charles and Diana would finally divorce in 1996. No longer Her Royal Highness, Diana would remain the People's Princess, using the ever-present media attention to champion even the most controversial humanitarian causes. Then came that fatal night in August 1997. Princess Diana and Dodi Al Fayed had just left the Ritz Hotel in Paris and were speeding down a tunnel pursued by a flock of paparazzi. After the crash and the news that Diana was dead, the French public placed flowers where she'd lain. In London, long before dawn broke, thousands of people were bringing wreaths to the royal family's London home, Buckingham Palace, and to Kensington Palace, where Diana had lived. Already, people were ignorantly assuming that the royal family should be on London's streets, mixing with the masses and displaying their grief.
Well, perhaps she ought to show her sorrows about Lady Di and what a great loss it's been, you know, and as you can see, the whole world loves her.
The Queen had wanted a family funeral in which her traumatized grandsons, Princes William and Harry, would be protected from the morbid attention of strangers. Instead, she would be pressed into breaking all royal protocol, having to accept the full ceremony of a state funeral and lowering the palace flag to half-mast. It was an emotional time, but many of those who were there, with the wisdom of hindsight, would remember Diana's death as a time when the people trespassed on the royal family's private grief. There would be another sad day for the Queen only 2 months later, poignant rather than tragic, that revealed how powerful the memories of a long-reigning monarch could be. The Queen and her husband Philip were saying farewell to the royal yacht Britannia, the ship that had been their floating home for nearly half a century, but was now too expensive to run. And what a cargo of sweet memories it had left them with. For a rare moment, the Queen's eyes filled with tears as the Britannia sailed out of their lives. Looking back at the high and the low points of the dying 20th century, the Queen must have wondered what had happened to respect for royalty, especially in the last decade, with its public mockery of almost everything she held dear.
Blues, 20th century blues are getting me down. Fools escape those very 20th century blues.
Diana's death had been a crisis point for the House of Windsor, and as the new millennium dawned, the Queen was the focus of attention and debate as to the relevance of the royal family in 21st century Britain.
20th century dear, in a strange illusion, chaos and confusion.
He's gorgeous, he's sweet, I love him.
The blues would lift, for in the year 2000, both Charles's sons made significant moves. Prince William, in his gap year, moved into the rugged mountain country of Patagonia, working with a community of international youngsters and insisting that he be treated as one of the gang. He was. They made him clean the lavatories.
Marigolds are now officially a fashion item.
Prince Harry was spotted looking smart and military as he led the Guard of Honor at his school, Eton. He looked even happier when he left school. It was a different story for the boy's great aunt, Princess Margaret. who was in a wretched state after suffering a stroke. The Queen Mother was in better health than her daughter, who would die within a few months. Margaret would be remembered by the older generation as a woman who dazzled all who met her. She was a princess trapped by the rigid rules of her time. It was just a month later, in 2002, that the Queen Mother died, happy and vivacious to the last. She had lived a barely credible 101 years. Her funeral was a time for reflection on everything the great lady had seen and done in a remarkable life. 4 generations of Windsors attended her funeral. In the streets outside, thousands of ordinary people waited to see her coffin pass and whisper a prayer for the lady with a noble heart. The Queen summed up her mother's life with a line from a poem. You can shed tears that she has gone, or you can smile because she has lived.
In 1555, Mary Tudor had all the signs of pregnancy, but no child came. Almost 500 years later, the mystery is beginning to be unraveled. Original letters held at the Public Record Office reveal what was on her mind. Today, historian John Guy is showing them to somebody who could make sense of the mystery. Fertility expert, Professor Howard Jacobs.
Is that Mary's writing?
A secretary wrote the body of this letter, but she signed it.
She signed it
in her own hand. Philip too. Mary actually touched this document.
That's remarkable, isn't it?
These documents prove that Mary was so certain of her pregnancy that she had prepared letters in advance announcing the birth to all the most important rulers in Europe.
And where, as it hath pleased Almighty God of his infinite goodness, to add unto the great number of other his benefits bestowed upon us, the gladding of us with the happy deliverance of a prince.
Of a prince?
She even knows the sex of this baby.
Yes, so persuaded was she that she was pregnant, she even reckoned she knew it's the child's sex.
That's right.
Yeah.
And of course, these letters are not dated. Look, there are spaces here. So, in fact, they prepared these in advance, and they were just going to fill in the date afterwards.
What an extraordinary series of letters to have prepared. I suppose it speaks to their conviction that she really was pregnant.
Was Mary so desperate to be pregnant that she'd conjured up the signs of pregnancy? There were those at court who believed she'd imagined the whole thing. Yet her physicians were convinced of her symptoms. What was going on? For the first time, Howard Jacobs thinks he has a medical explanation for this mystery. He believes that Mary's symptoms were not those of pregnancy, but signs that she had a hormone problem. Medical records held at the Public Records Office reveal that from puberty, Mary suffered from several key symptoms: severe headaches, missed periods, milk emitting from her breasts, and the description that she was prematurely aged. Howard Jacobs has seen patients with these symptoms before. Using an MRI scanner, it is possible to see deep inside the brain to find the place where hormones are controlled from. Professor Jacobs believes that this control center, called the pituitary gland, lies at the heart of all Mary's problems. Normally, the gland is only the size of a pea, but it can become tumorous and swell to the size of a walnut. In this state, it disrupts hormone production and can even make the breasts express milk.
When there's a pituitary tumor, like we see here, you get this strange situation where the menstrual cycle switched off, where the woman may have milk in her breasts, but she's not pregnant. In a sense, it almost imitates a pregnancy, but of course the paradox is, since the woman isn't ovulating, she can't actually conceive it, which becomes a case of infertility.
The very thing that was making Mary think she was pregnant was actually making her infertile. But there were other telltale symptoms too. Her eyesight rapidly deteriorated, so much so that she had to have all her letters read to her.
As the tumor gets larger, and as it extends upwards, as we see here, the first thing it does is disrupt vision. The normal optic nerve would be about there, and you can see the tumor extends right up well above it, and so we can be sure that this patient would have started with an impairment of vision such that they would have lost peripheral vision, they wouldn't be able to see out the sides of their eyes, but actually with a swelling that big, you can be sure their vision would be impaired and they'd actually be able to see very little indeed. I think almost certainly Mary Tudor must have had a pituitary tumour. She had a long history of a menstrual disturbance dating right back into her youth. There's the well-documented account of milk in the breast at a time when she hadn't been pregnant. Long-standing story of recurrent headache, and then the impaired vision so bad that she's unable to read her court correspondence and had to have it read to her.
The symptoms caused by a pituitary tumour could explain why Mary thought she was pregnant. Today, she could be treated successfully with a course of drugs that control hormone production. In just 6 weeks, the tumour would shrink, her symptoms would disappear, and she could even get pregnant. But Mary's situation was hopeless. She'd been abandoned by her husband, and the tumour that had made her believe she was pregnant was actually killing her. Recognizing that the end was near, she begged her half-sister, Elizabeth, to retain the Roman Catholic faith. But it was to no avail. On the 17th of November, 1558, Mary died. Elizabeth was crowned, and gradually England became Protestant. Mary's reign was almost obliterated from history. The effigy on her tomb here at Westminster Abbey is not hers, but that of Elizabeth, whose coffin crushes that of Mary's beneath. The secret of her medical problem has lain buried here for nearly 500 years. Nearly 130 years after the death of Mary Tudor, medical ignorance about women's fertility would again cause a crisis in the monarchy. The Stuart dynasty was now on the throne of England and Scotland, but the king, James II, was Catholic. This time the country needed a Protestant heir, and the only hope lay with James's Protestant daughter, Princess Anne. In 1687, Anne was pregnant with what she hoped would be a boy. She lived here, in the heart of London, with her husband George and their 2 young daughters at the Palace of Whitehall. Today, little remains of the original palace, but the area is still at the heart of Britain's political life.
Whitehall in the late 17th century is like a rabbit warren built for elephants to run in. In other words, it's not a designer palace. It's an incredible gaggle of buildings of all different sizes and ages, mostly old, mostly big.
But this palace was no fortress. A killer was lurking in the streets of London, and its name was smallpox. In February 1687, this infectious disease swept through the Palace of Whitehall and devastated Anne's world. She miscarried. Then within a week, her youngest daughter, Anne Sophia, also died. And 6 days later, the eldest, Mary, was carried away by the disease. The royal nursery was abandoned, and the hopes of British Protestants were devastated in a matter of weeks. For the first time, Anne made the short journey from Whitehall to bury her daughters in a place which was to become all too familiar: the Stuart Vault at Westminster Abbey. The vault was adorned with a magnificent effigy of Anne's great-great-grandmother, Mary, Queen of Scots. Now it became home to Anne's 2 infant daughters.
In Anne's lifetime, virtually every family in England can expect to lose children in childbirth or infancy. But what's really important about Anne is the crucial vulnerability of her position as the last hope of her church and her royal house, the last hope of a Protestant Stuart for the throne.
Anne quickly fell pregnant again, but in October 1687, she gave birth prematurely to a stillborn boy. The Stuart Vault was opened, and another tiny coffin added. And in 1688, tragedy struck again when she miscarried another child. By now, she had lost 6 children in pregnancy or early infancy. The royal death toll was recorded in the Abbey's own register of births and deaths.
The Lady Mary, daughter to Her Royal Highness Princess Anne of
Lady
Denmark.
Anne Sophia, youngest daughter to their Royal Highnesses, was buried February the 4th, 1687.
Anne bore her misfortunes bravely. In a letter to her closest friend, Lady Marlborough, who had suffered a similar tragedy, Anne wrote,
"Knowing very well what it is to lose a child, time is the only cure for all misfortunes."
After 6 pregnancies, Anne still had no Protestant heir. At this time, infant mortality was common, and her misfortune was put down to the foul air in London. Under the advice of her physicians, she retired to the tranquility of Hampton Court, where her luck finally changed.
In 1689, Anne gives birth to a child not exactly healthy and not exactly strong, but is male and is at least alive with promise the future. The tiny boy is saddled with a terrific title of Duke of Gloucester, which is very, very rarely given to a child that young and that vulnerable.
Gloucester was Anne's pride and joy, and although his childhood began happily at Hampton Court, he was a sickly child. In a letter to Lady Marlborough, Anne wrote,
"My poor boy had his ague again. It lasted 7 hours and made him very sick."
With Gloucester so poorly, it was Anne's duty to keep producing Protestant babies. But pregnancy after pregnancy ended in failure. The burial records at Westminster Abbey record the loss of 4 more babies. Of her 11 pregnancies in 10.5 years of marriage, Anne only had 1 surviving child, Gloucester. Although miscarriages and stillbirths were more common then, Anne had far exceeded the average. What was going on? At the time, contemporaries placed the blame firmly on the mother.
Really, the onus was put very much on women to take very good care of themselves. They were responsible for nurturing the child when it was in their womb, and anything they did that could affect this balance, this fine balance, could result in a miscarriage.
Anne shouldered much of the blame, but as royalty, she had access to supposedly the best treatment of the day. But this privileged position held its own perils.
The greatest single hazard of being ill and rich in the late 17th century is having to contend with top doctors. Anne's illnesses in pregnancy were treated like any other illness. In other words, she was purged. She was purged literally. She was given vomits and purges. She was given enemas. She was bled constantly. And what these 3 things do together is they sap the will, and above all, they sap the body's energy. So the doctors were hastening the chances of miscarriage and sickly children, even while they strove to avert them.
An extraordinary modern-day discovery suggests that the answer to her tragic condition lay in her royal blood. Today, miscarriages are still the most common complication in pregnancy. At St Thomas's Hospital in the heart of London, a recent breakthrough by Dr. Graham Hughes and his colleagues may explain why Anne's pregnancies kept ending in failure.
The discovery that we made is that some women with recurrent miscarriages are treatable because they have sticky blood. They have a tendency for the blood to become too clotty, and the blood doesn't get through the tiny little blood vessels in the placenta. The baby doesn't get the oxygen, and the patient miscarries. And it's a huge story because 1 in 5 patients, women with recurrent miscarriages, have got this.
In 1983, Graham Hughes and his colleagues discovered that the antibodies which cause the blood to be sticky could be detected in a simple blood test. In honor of his discovery, the disease was called Hughes syndrome. Professor Hughes suspects that sticky blood is what was at the root of Anne's problems.
Queen Anne must have had Hughes syndrome or sticky blood because patients who have got these antibodies get recurrent fetal loss. And that can happen at any stage in the pregnancy, from the very earliest to quite late on in the pregnancy. Some patients are just like Queen Anne, multiple pregnancy failures, and in the end, no successful pregnancy.
5 more pregnancies ended in disaster. But worse was yet to come. Just 6 days after his 11th birthday, Anne's only son, Gloucester, died of smallpox, on the 30th of July, 1700. Now all Anne's children were dead. The Stuart burial chamber was opened once more to receive another coffin. In the end, Anne lost 17 children. She spent over 16 years pregnant and sacrificed her health to the cause. What might have saved her is a simple tablet found in practically every bathroom cabinet today. Aspirin. This common drug thins the blood and prevents it clotting, ensuring the placenta can deliver everything the growing fetus needs to survive.
With hindsight, I mean, the tragedy is she would have been so treatable if this was the diagnosis, and so treatable, might have altered the course of history.
Anne ruled over England for another 14 years, knowing that she was the end of the Stuart line. Her coffin lies in the Stuart vault, along with those of her 17 children. The nation knew little of Anne's suffering, but 100 years later, a royal love affair would become public property. The whole nation lived and breathed every detail of the pregnancy. The outcome would not only change the monarchy, but would also rock the foundations of medical science.